Thanks, Darlene. That's wonderful. And it has been really good to work with you too again, especially getting Opening All Options up and going and getting some really current information out there for the disability practitioners and the academics across the sectors. I guess we just wanted to start with saying, you know, we, I guess, are really privileged to be a part of this. We've both done our research around specific learning disabilities, so to be a part of the Opening All Options package is quite exciting for us, and we've been able to apply quite a lot of knowledge that's come to us through the voice of practitioners and the voice of students. Jo, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just appreciating the student perspective has been really fascinating in ensuring that their voices are heard and that this hidden disability group that's often misunderstood is understood a little bit better through today's conversation.
Yeah. So to start off, we'll just run you through a contents page, which is on the next slide, Darlene. So for people who are new, I guess, to the disability role in education, you won't have that historical context of Opening All Options. And for me, when I was a new DLO many, many years ago, it was like a Bible. When I came across Opening All Options, it just opened my eyes and my knowledge to what students with specific learning disabilities were experiencing. But having moved through many years of experience, I realise now that there were still some shortcomings. And what we've done as a project team with Darlene and Jane and Jo and myself is look at what disability practitioners are saying are the gaps in knowledge when they come into tertiary ed, and also, as you know, even for some who are more experienced, what's missing in the knowledge that we're providing across our sector. So Opening All Options will provide information about what SLD is. It provides information about a framework to work with students with SLD, really places emphasis on the relationship between the practitioner and the student. We also included a screening and referral process. DLOs are not diagnosticians, but they do need to be really smart about picking indicators for specific learning disabilities, and I guess understanding the range of profiles that come with that diagnosis of specific learning disability. So that screening and referral process has been built quite explicitly for the new disability practitioner to use and for the more experienced practitioner to review and utilise. We also talk about what is involved in assessment for SLD. That's really important. That was one of the gaps I found when I started many years ago. I could identify that a person wasn't comprehending what they were reading, but I didn't understand what was happening for them at a cognitive level. So understanding what a psychologist will assess for assists us to determine exactly what adjustments we need to be putting in place for them. So a little bit more explicit information about the different profiles of SLD and the importance of collaborating with academics and working with them to develop reasonable adjustments on behalf of the student. There's also tips for new practitioners, and that's come through Jo and my research. We spoke directly with practitioners who are experiencing success in the approach they have with SLD. So quite a lot of tips for new practitioners that I think will be really valuable. The range of profiles, aligning our adjustments and teaching strategies. Jo has a particular bent on universal design strategies, which is critically important to, I guess, including all students with disabilities, but creating an environment for students with SLD to not be on the fringe, to be genuinely included and participating in their learning. And lastly, we included academic skills support, which wasn't a component of the last Opening All Options, and that's a critical factor that Jo can talk more to because it came through her research with students. So Jo, what we know about specific learning disability?
Yes, so I guess you should have in front of you the definition through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but more importantly, I guess just recognising that specific learning disability is a specific and not global impairment, so it affects specific areas of functioning, and importantly, it can impact each individual quite differently. So we might find that one person will have strengths in maybe communicating information verbally but may have weaknesses in processing the written word, whereas somebody else might have completely the opposite profile. So we always encourage to get to know each individual student and what their processing preferences are, what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. That's best determined through a formal specific learning disability assessment with a psychologist. And once we know that information, we can work really closely with the student on determining the best supports for them. And dyslexia is the most common of all specific learning disabilities, impacting 80 to 85% of people with an SLD. And SLDs is in fact one of the most common, if not the most common, disability that we would encounter in society across any culture or any language. So it impacts approximately 10% of the population. We don't have consistently accurate statistics in Australia because it's not well supported or not well understood in every context. But we know from international research in America and the UK that it impacts approximately 10% of the population.
Thanks, Jo. And I think, Darlene, did you move to the next slide, what we know? The second slide on what we know?
Yep,
it's just some dot points. Yeah, excellent. Dot points on what Jo had just covered, I guess. So I guess the key points in there is that people with SLD have a range of abilities as well as a range of difficulties in the area of academic learning. And the key for us is to actually harness abilities to build strengths to overcome those barriers in the academic environment. And that's what this whole Opening All Options resource has been designed to do, to support disability practitioners. Now, the education context in Australia, and I'm not sure how, we won't go into this in great detail, but Australia is so far behind the rest of the English-speaking world. We are yet to formally recognise specific learning disabilities such as dyslexia in our primary and secondary systems. We're only just now seeing a really strong federal push down to the states to start to embed awareness. And this is occurring in our compulsory education sector regardless of disability discrimination legislation at a federal level. So what's happening for the post-secondary sector is that people are arriving, I guess, at TAFE and universities and other providers having very little knowledge about their learning difficulties and having received very little support or academic accommodations around their learning disabilities. Jo, you wanted to add to that, I know, because of the work you've done with students. You had some really quite powerful stories.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Julie. And I guess the work that Julie and I have both done, and along with my research, has shown that students often get quite angry when they are suddenly exposed to a whole range of amazing support in tertiary education to do with their specific learning disability, and are often first diagnosed at university or TAFE, and then in their reflections back on primary and secondary schooling, they often feel quite frustrated. Students will say, well, I was always excused from difficult tasks rather than empowered in developing techniques to manage those tasks. So they'll get quite angry that they never learnt to write well until starting university and connecting with disability supports and with the learning skills advisors. So many students will come with maybe inappropriate strategies or undeveloped strategies from secondary schools, so that transition is even more important in developing the right skills and awareness and support, and working through with students some of their frustrations and anger as well when they reflect back on their primary schooling and secondary schooling.
Yeah, and I think, Jo, one of the stories, or a few of the stories I listened to when you were running your focus groups with students, I guess what you just touched on about the anger, that was so deeply entrenched in some of those students. They were so angry at being ripped off through their compulsory education system. And while they appreciated the DLO and academics in their new environment actually sitting down and listening to them, it made them even more aware of what they had lost, the opportunities they'd lost in the past. So they were really powerful stories, and they've really influenced how Joe and I have designed Opening All Options in partnership with Joe and with Darlene and Jane, really having the student's voice coming through the recommendations for our practice. So if you move on to the disability practitioners in tertiary education slide, Darlene, the other thing that's coming through quite strongly for us is that disability practitioners in tertiary education are pioneers in Australia. We're doing research at the moment across the primary and compulsory education sector, and we have teachers who are trying their hearts out but have not been equipped with the knowledge they need to support students with SLD. They haven't received the training in their pre-service teacher education. They're actually seeking it on their own. What we have in the tertiary education sector is 20 years of practice wisdom that our DLOs have shared and passed down to new DLOs through their very structured networks, state by state. So, you know, it's a shame that we don't have more research coming out of the tertiary education sector about our practice, because our research has revealed that we have quite sophisticated practice coming through our DLO services in TAFEs and universities across Australia. And I guess we really want to emphasise that quite strongly through our presentation. For us to be sharing what we have, we can influence at the compulsory education sector as well. The model of practice that's coming through our disability services that are experiencing success with students with specific learning disabilities, and especially through Jo's research where she's worked with students who have experienced success through tertiary education. Jo and I have found very strong synergies between the practitioner's perspective on what facilitates success and the student's experience of what facilitates success. And that can be really wrapped up quite nicely in the framework of personalised learning, which is on the next slide there, Darlene. The DLOs that are working really well with students with specific learning disabilities, they position the learner at the centre, they build really strong relationships with those students from the very, very early days. And students who say they have developed really strong positive relationships with DLOs will also say that this is the first time somebody has sat down with me and genuinely asked, what is my lived experience of dyslexia? They really ask the questions that are meaningful for the student and want to know the nuts and bolts of how their life has worked, their educational history, where they have succeeded, where they have had difficulties, and really understand the strengths and the deficits, I guess, of each individual student. The research around personalised learning reflects beautifully, I guess, the model of practice that we've come across as we interview the DLOs that are working successfully with students with specific learning disability. They embed universal design in their practice. They work with academics to talk about universal design. They have a human rights approach to access and genuine participation. They personalise and understand every student uniquely and what their profile. They understand their profile of SLD. They are looking for sustainable solutions. And I guess the key to that is we can have support when we're in tertiary education, but how do those solutions travel with that student into their world of employment? So our focus is not on I guess, expensive and commercial interventions while they're in tertiary education. We have to focus on interventions that become portable and can move with students, or that can be implemented in different environments. So the DLOs working really well have this mindset and they have this framework that they're working to. Jo, did you want to add anything around that personalised learning framework?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I guess just a really nice example given by one of my research participants. Found it very impressive when she met with her DLO for the first time at TAFE, and she said, look, the DLO just asked me, do I prefer to listen to things or have information written down? Do I need to take my own notes or have somebody else summarise notes for me? And she said it was just such a lovely conversation about her processing preferences, what were her barriers and what were the supports to match her barriers, and how to harness her strengths as well within her SLD profile. And she was so impressed with that approach that she said it was just so simple and straightforward, but something she'd never had at primary school or high school. But just it stems from that conversation, personal practice, and then creating solutions based on individual needs.
Yeah, thank you. And what we've done with the Opening All Options resource has embedded elements of the personalised learning that's critical to building the relationship with the student and to explore and assess for the student's strengths and for the student's difficulties, and I guess to explore within the environment how we remove barriers to genuine participation for the individual students. So the resource has been designed to step a new DLO, I guess, through the stages of understanding personalised learning, building the relationship, asking specific questions, and it goes so far as to actually give examples of some of those questions. And if you look at the next slide, Darlene, learner-centred practice, I guess the whole framework of Opening All Options is around building relationships and becoming the person that really understands the lived experience of SLD for that student, and exploring with that student what their strengths are. So strength-based practice is integral to this model of practice, and within that is solution and future-oriented interventions. So solution-focused practice, the DLOs that we spoke to across Victoria, they're very solution-focused. They were able to harness the strengths of students and look to their past where they had success, and it didn't have to be in an education environment, but where the student could identify, I feel strong, competent and capable in this environment. They could break that down with the student and actually pull out the unique skills and knowledge of that student, and then start to apply those strengths to a future in education, applying every unique individual strength of the student to solutions to removing barriers in the education environment. And that's the sophisticated practice that we were coming across in our research. It was mind-blowing. I must say I was in awe of some of the DLOs that we talked to through our research, and to hear the student story behind that through Jo's research that really reinforced. They actually identified some of the DLOs that we were interviewing in the other research, and it really reinforced the power of the practice and the empowerment, I guess, that was imposed and supported for the student. Jo, the other dot point on, sorry, there was building self-awareness and advocacy, and I think that's a strength that comes out of your research.
Yeah, for sure. And just a couple of other things too. Look, thinking of some of the students who said at primary school and high school they were just given a whole lot of different ways to avoid doing tasks, yet just drawing on your point around building strengths and getting to know the student, they mentioned many times that at TAFE and university they were then empowered with different technology or skills or strategies to actually undertake tasks and experience success for the first time. And so many participants in my research, their very first opportunity to experience success was in tertiary education. And those students were the same students that said, I became the go-to student or the smart student in class at TAFE or uni. However, they said, you know, I was always in the dumbass class that they called it at primary school or high school, and always felt left behind and unable to show their potential in secondary school. So it's really interesting to see that putting into practice this learner-centred approach and building on strengths and also developing strategies to build on weaknesses as well is actually incredibly powerful for the students. That, you know, many of them broke down and cried when they said, you know, this is my first time I've actually felt like I'm intelligent and capable. So it's been quite a powerful story that we hear from these students. And in terms of building self-awareness, really the diagnosis was the most powerful factor for these students in my study.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of these students have come from a context where they say, don't label, it's going to damage them. But you know what? These students are labelling themselves in the playground. The labels that they shared with me before their diagnosis were, you know, I was the dumb kid, I was the stupid kid, I was always told I was lazy and not trying hard enough. So we know these children and parents and adults are labelling regardless of a diagnosis. The difference is once students gain a diagnosis, they're saying, wow, okay, I'm dyslexic, that's okay, and say, but I'm really good at this, this and this, and I need some assistance in these areas. And they understand this profile. And so many of the participants in my study said, finally, I'm not stupid, you know, after their diagnosis, and said, this is what's going on for me, and gained a lot more confidence once they had their diagnosis. One of the factors prior to the diagnosis was that students would globalise their self-identity to say, oh, I find this difficult, therefore I'm stupid, and would globalise that rather than after their diagnosis they would compartmentalise that as part of who they were and would say, oh, I'm actually not stupid, I'm really smart, but I have some difficulty and need assistance in these areas. So their whole self-identity shifted once they gained their diagnosis.
Yeah. And Jo, that leads really nicely into the next screen on the screening process. And this is the first phase, I guess, of supporting students to start to understand what might be going on for them, and also assist the DLO in determining whether a referral for a formal diagnosis of dyslexia or other SLD is required. And I think this is where, I know when I was in the DLO role, I would struggle with making that referral because of the cost to people. It's not a funded support that we see for people with disability, with SLD. So it can often cost up to, you know, $1,100 or $1,200 for a really, really good diagnosis and report for someone with SLD. So one of the areas that I needed support in when I was a DLO was understanding the screening process, understanding what am I looking for before I make that recommendation. I don't want to send them off and let the recommendation tell me whether they have it or not, because that's a burden I'm placing on the student. So the screening process is really important. And in the original Opening All Options, there was a lovely little flowchart that could help you differentiate between whether the person had English as a second language issues or whether the person had an SLD. And that was great as a starting point for me. And we talked about putting that back into the new package, but we actually haven't. We've actually encompassed it differently by giving the DLO a series of questions. If we're going to align this with personalised learning, we need more than a flowchart to tick off. We need to actually start building the relationship. So we took that flowchart and broke it down into a screening process where the DLO has I guess a sample question to ask around particular areas of difficulty that will assist the DLO to determine whether this is an indicator of dyslexia or another SLD, or whether this is an indicator of perhaps gaps in formative education or impact from comprehension through medication. There's a whole range of issues that could impact learning that are not SLD. So we've developed a screening process, and we've actually researched quite broadly to ensure that the questions we're asking are those that would be endorsed through any SLD assessment process. So do you want to move to the next slide, Darlene, which goes into the formal assessment? So from the screening process, at the end of a screening process with a student, you will have a very clear indication through the tool we've provided whether you need to then move on to formal assessment. And that's a really important point, because that's where you have some deeper level conversations with the student about, I guess, what they're going to face when they go into a formal assessment, what it entails, what a label might mean to them. It's where you need to contextualize, like Joe was talking. You've been carrying a label of stupid or dumb or not competent. An assessment will give you identification of where your learning deficits are, but it will also determine whether you have average to higher intelligence, and that's the discrepancy we see for people with SLD. Joe, did you want to add a little bit before we go into the formal assessment here? The profiling, for example? Yeah.
Yeah, look, certainly for students to really understand, like typically learning disability, people have average to above average intelligence, and certainly developing a specific learning disability profile occurs through a formal assessment. And once people know their strengths, and often they fall within the top 5% in certain areas of processing, and so we'll identify their strengths and how they can actually use those to improve their ability to study and what strategies they're going to use. And then identifying the areas where they might be quite low, and for students to then develop the support strategies to help address those weaknesses, as well as developing independent learning strategies. So it could be using assistive technology or developing other techniques to build on their weaknesses is quite critical when we're looking at the assessment and what that assessment means in terms of academic supports.
Yeah, it also endorses intervention. It validates what we can do inside the education organisation. And I guess we need to do that for any person with a disability. We need to have that evidence. But a formal assessment will actually specify and target the intervention for us. And I can't reinforce enough how inadequate I used to feel as a new DLO, because I didn't understand sometimes what the profiling of an SLD meant. I didn't understand the terminology. I didn't understand what a cognitive processing deficit really meant. Back then we were still in visual processing. What does that mean to dyslexia? But now we know, vision is not connected to dyslexia. It's around sound and hearing. So there's so much that a DLO needs to get their head around. And I think the formal assessment is critical. When we have strong indicators of an SLD, we need to move forward to that formal assessment, because it is actually our map for intervention. If we get a good assessment back, and we've actually included in the Opening All Options resource a referral letter that guides the DLO on how to identify the strengths of a student, the difficulties the student is experiencing, and what to ask from that formal assessment. And if you go to the next slide, Darlene, what we need from an assessment, we can talk to that a little bit more, but that next slide will actually give us evidence that the SLD exists, but it will profile that SLD. And what we didn't have before in Opening All Options was understanding the various profiles that occur for individuals with a specific learning disability. And even for the diagnosis of dyslexia, there are so many different profiles and makeup, for that disability. So what is happening for the individual? I know I was guilty of applying standard interventions because dyslexia means difficulty with the written word. Okay, well, we'll have a note taker. Some people don't need a note taker. Some people need a very different intervention. So it's understanding what that might be, and a very good assessment will actually break down your interventions and recommendations back in their report to you. So the way we've designed your referral process in Opening All Options demands of the psychologist doing the assessment to give you back very explicit guidance and instructions on what will be the most meaningful and effectual interventions for the individual student's profile. The other element to that, internationally we're moving away from the discrepancy model for SLD. We no longer see discrepancy in the formal diagnostic processes, but there was a recent research across Australia last year that shows that Australian psychologists are still assessing against IQ. So we've maintained that because 85% of the psychologists across Australia still believe that the IQ assessment is one of their strongest indicators in the discrepancy model for dyslexia. So, and we actually agree with that too. The power of diagnosis that has come through Joe's research around, I have average intelligence, but I was labelled slow and dumb and put in special education classes. The power of learning the capability that I have and the potential I have can flip a person's world and just open up all the opportunities there are for them. And I remember one of the DLOs telling me that it took quite a while for them to work through the process of referral for an adult woman who believed she was intellectually incapacitated. And when she finally got her diagnosis assessment and saw that her IQ was actually above average, she explained it to me that the woman was almost doing cartwheels down the hallway with her assessment to show her. And that woman had gone on to graduate and move overseas to work in a dream job that she'd had. But prior to that, she had limited herself because of her label of dumb. So we believe assessment is critical where the indicators show up in your screening process. But we've also included all of those guidance notes and I guess referral steps inside the letter. They are guidance for you. You can adapt and change and do what you need with those, but they will guide you on what you need to ask the psychologist so that you get a clear understanding of what profile of SLD is occurring for that student. Then that leads us into reasonable adjustments, I guess. And Joe, did you want to introduce the reasonable adjustments?
Yeah, sure. And I guess just launching back from the diagnosis and perceptions that others have of people with a specific learning disability, that often there is that discrepancy as well in that space where people with a specific learning disability, especially once they've achieved their diagnosis, will realise, hey, I'm actually really capable, and will have quite high aspirations, yet others may still have quite low expectations of people with a specific learning disability. And that came through very strongly in my research in the secondary education sector, where students would consistently put in the special education class, which the students in my study all seem to call the dumbass class, which is pretty common language. And they would just feel as though people didn't think they could achieve much. So when people then applied to get into tertiary education and have been full, it's really shaken that thinking around expectations. We still know that many of the external exam processes that enable people to get into further education are quite a significant hurdle for people with an SLD because adjustments won't be made during that exam process. So many of our tertiary students at university level often will come through TAFE, experience success for the first time at TAFE, and then go on to university. So we know that's quite a typical transition pathway for people who have come from a space where they've had low expectations and then start to return into education through TAFE and then go on to university. So we often find that identifying what adjustments are made can take a while and take a little bit of trial and error. Using the assessment as a fantastic foundation, some students have reported to me that they don't feel entitled to adjustments, so it's important to work through with the student to say these adjustments are in place to create a level playing field for you, because in their past education experiences they've either been denied adjustments or been told, look, it's not fair on the others, not realising, hey, this is actually a legitimate disability, the others don't need it. The people with a specific learning disability will need specific adjustments to demonstrate their capacity. So really thinking through what adjustments match the learning profile of students, how to harness their strengths but also support their weaknesses. So the adjustments are, yeah, they're often worked out through that conversation with the student and reference to their learning profile in their assessment.
Yeah, and I guess the other point with reasonable adjustments, Jo, is the DLOs that were, I guess, facilitating whole of organisation awareness and were very good at universal design strategies across the organisation had come to understand that while they may understand the specific learning disability through the assessment that comes back and have a more enhanced, I guess, awareness of what conceptual processing is and what processing speed is, and you know, understand what's happening for the profile of the student, they also understood that they can't get inside every training package and every university course and understand the academic requirements, the assessment requirements, the inherent requirements that students are actually assessed as they work through those units of competency or units in higher education. So these DLOs work very closely with the academic, and I think the creative stories that we got through our research about sometimes the reasonable adjustment report didn't actually happen because sitting down with the student, the DLO and the academic could identify a universal design approach. I could do this for all students. I could alter this just slightly and it would make it different for you, but it would benefit all students. So they started to work much more on a universal design approach that moved the student away from special and different things to just having, I guess, participation opened up to them through an awareness by the academic. And that was facilitated through the DLO having that very strong self-awareness that while they can be an expert on knowledge about a disability with the student, they need the expert knowledge of the academic to work on building adjustments that don't water down courses. And our students have told us very clearly that, is that a timer, Darlene? Our students have told us very clearly.
Sorry, Julie, I don't know where those end. Cheers.
Okay. One of the strong messages that came through from our students was that if you water the course down, or if the adjustments are extreme, I might qualify from this course, but I may never believe that I have justly deserved my award. So the more that we could turn things into universal design and open up participation, and students felt that they were actually achieving at the same level as their peers through the course, the power for that student on completion was magnified, enormously. They believed they had the same skills as their peers. They believed they could apply for the same employment opportunities or advance their study. So how we put reasonable adjustments in place is critical, and not always about having a support worker sitting beside that person with a disability. One of the I guess, most powerful strategies is assistive technology, and that's on the next slide there, Darlene. And what we included in opening all options was a SETT framework that has been developed and used internationally across a number of universities and vocational education sectors. And SETT is a model for determining the appropriate, I guess, inclusive assistive technology that will work to the profile of a student. I know that across education in Australia, years gone by, we've tried our hardest, but I know that we bought expensive commercial products, and because we had them rolled out across the institute, or the university, we almost tried to fit people into, round people into square boxes to use this technology. And we didn't have a really good understanding of when is voice to text important, when is text to voice important, when is a graphic organizer more important than any of the speech technologies. So understanding our profile of SLD, which comes through our screening and our formal assessment process on opening all options, we then begin to apply a SETT framework that looks at the most appropriate inclusive technologies, assistive technology that we can use for that student. But what we've done also really poorly in Australia is we've assumed ICT skills, and we know that the latest research coming out, and this is not just in Australia, in English-speaking countries, that this assumption around ICT skills has actually watered down and depleted skills, because we've removed IT courses from a number of organisations. We know that while 70% of households might have a computer, only 40% of our population understand how to use a computer for anything more than social media. So a lot of people returning to study who have a specific learning disability are people that are second chance learners, and they don't have fundamental ICT skills. So teaching how to use technology alongside teaching someone how to use assistive technology is a key ingredient that we've sometimes overlooked, and that's really, really important when we determine whether assistive technology is the right way to go forward. They need to have fundamental skills in computing before we start to introduce them to complex software programs. On the other hand, we also have very simple programs on our iPhone, drag and dictation. So, introducing them to mainstream software solutions that can be much more universal than commercial products where they have to come to the TAFE to use it or come to the university to use it. So the SETT framework has been stepped out in the Opening All Options resource, and at each point of student environment task and tools, there's guidance notes to support the DLO to work through that assessment with the student. The next slide moves us into another really important area, which is academic and study skills. And Jo, I know you had some really key points you wanted to present here.
Yeah, sure. And just on the technology point as well, certainly from my research, it was the mainstream inclusive technologies, really following a universal design principle that the students with the specific learning disabilities embraced far more than any adaptive technology. And it just normalised how they used equipment that really targeted their learning profile. So they would use things like word prediction or text prediction applications, or things like Dragon on their iPhone, or audio record lectures in a way that was quite acceptable for any student to do. So certainly using some of the mainstreamable technology has been really beneficial for students with an SLD. In terms of the academic study skills, not only using technology, but developing a whole range of study skills techniques, and it could be around mind mapping or reading strategies, writing strategies. There's a whole range of techniques that students with an SLD develop, and often those techniques were really well developed when students met with the learning skills advisors at their universities. So that often occurred through a referral from the disability advisor across to the learning skills advisor, and they were able to gain some really targeted one-on-one tuition around what skills they needed to build on, and the learning skills advisors were absolute experts for these students in empowering them on skills that they may have never had the opportunity to develop in the past.
Yeah, and Jo, you mentioned earlier about your students being excused, I guess, through the secondary school system and allowed not to participate in some of the academic requirements. And that's the story that we hear through the DLO office often. The students that they're already failing in primary school with an SLD, and they very quickly fall behind their peers, and by the time they get to secondary school they are almost excused or not expected to be able to participate at the academic level that others their age and year level are doing. So when we get them in the tertiary environment, they often have never really constructed an essay. They don't understand the organisation of constructing, you know, a paragraph from topic, elaborating, authenticating and linking to the next paragraph. So some very fundamental academic skills. And the success that was coming through from the disability research was the DLOs were actually doing what you said, Jo, and linking with learning support and working collaboratively. So they were supporting students to develop fundamental academic skills at the same time as getting their head around the content in their course, and sometimes simultaneously introducing some of that mainstream software like dictating your thoughts to Dragon and going back over it later and not losing those thoughts because my working memory's getting in the way of maintaining my thoughts. So there was this quite sophisticated model of intervention. And so we have included in Opening All Options, I guess, these strategies and the importance of embedding every element of it depending on the student and the strengths and the difficulties that they're presenting with.
Sorry, Julie, can I just interrupt for a minute? We're just getting a lot of background noise. I don't know if Julie or Jo, if there's somebody talking in the background of your place, but we're getting a lot of male voices talking and so forth.
They're coming through my headset too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've tried to
they're in my headset too, yeah.
Yeah, we've been trying to mute Jo, so I don't know if it's her environment. But anyway, so just to let you know that we've got probably only 10 minutes to go. So
excellent. And we've only really got 2 key points, Jo, around the teaching and universal design, and then we wanted to talk about the communities of practice. So
okay, well, Julie, I might let you talk to that, and I'll see if I can quieten that noise.
We'll mute you for the moment, Jo.
Okay, and I might just touch on this lightly because we've sort of included it right across the presentation, but we have emphasised through Opening All Options the power of universal design strategies. One of the, I guess, our findings is that power for the academic. DLOs have knowledge the academics don't have, and academics have knowledge the DLO don't have. And when you come together and can, I guess, come up with solutions that are universal in design and can support everybody who's studying in that course, that's quite a powerful approach. It also is quite empowering for the academic because it's enhancing their teaching practice as well. So teaching and universal design strategies are core to the whole process. It guides academics to become much more explicit. If we support our academics to understand how to break tasks down and give explicit instructions, to do that for every student is really important. So instead of changing it up just for 1 or 2, change it up for everybody and make your instructions extremely explicit so that there's no confusion that can happen. To break an assessment task down and be very explicit, for a person with an SLD, that means they can look at part 1 and work on that. And what they tell us is to look at the whole assessment task, and everything that's required can be so overwhelming for them that they give up before they start. So working on small parts of assessment tasks as they work through is really, really important. Teachers giving practical examples, once again being extremely explicit. It's a learning curve for them. So some DLOs actually worked with their departments that did the teacher or academic professional development and got inside there and started to deliver around practical examples, explicit teaching, explicit development of assessment tasks. And the change that came out of that was quite powerful. When you ask an academic to assess their assessment question and hand that out to other peers and have it interrogated and brought back, that's quite a powerful process and a vulnerable process for many. But for the students, the outcome of that was really, really powerful because the assessment question became very, very clear for everybody. So, you know, the DLO really does need, and we know this as DLOs, to work comprehensively and collaboratively across the organisation to embed universal design wherever possible. And I guess assistive technology in learning centres is critical as well. We've put different tips up on Opening All Options for you to look at on how to do that, but instead of working with one person for text-to-speech, having you know, information around the organisation that says if you require text-to-speech or headphones for text-to-speech, please contact the help desk. So, you know, like just making it very normal to have information like that available for students. And the last point that we wanted to talk about was, I guess, the DLOs that were evidencing really sophisticated practice for students with specific learning disabilities belonged to a community of practice. And it, you know, in Victoria it was the TDN, the TAFE Disability Network. They share together, they learnt together, they trusted each other, they talked openly about when they thought they might have made a mistake, when they hadn't assessed deeply enough, when they had imposed an intervention without really understanding the profile of the student. And through their sharing and honesty, they had developed a place where they could really build professional development collaboratively. So we can't reinforce enough how important that community of practice is. I know as a DLO many years ago, I went to TDN and I was overwhelmed by the knowledge that was sitting around the table, and I was too scared to say I thought I'd stuffed up. And it took me, I guess, 12 months before I had that level of comfort and could really draw on the expertise around the table. I used to go every month or 6 weeks and suck up all the information and take it away, but I didn't really openly give of myself and get enough information and guidance back. The DLOs that are at that sophisticated level, they are calling on each other constantly. They don't have to wait for a meeting. They've made their networks. They're really developing themselves, and they are practicing through a professional framework, which is that personalised learning model. Darlene, we might need to leave it there. I think our timing is...
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, Joe, if you just want to make the last final statement.
No, I think we're pretty close to it. We've only got 5 minutes to go, so if people had any questions.
So there was one question is, what percentage of students in the focus group that you had, Joe, were from CALD or Aboriginal backgrounds?
None of them from Aboriginal backgrounds, but probably only a very small percentage, 3 or 4 from other cultural backgrounds.
Yep. And the only other question we've got actually is around the Opening All Options resource. And so just to let you know, it actually is on ADCET's website, so that's adcet.edu.au/OAO. But it's also in the side button of the website, and so there's different pages with different content. So if you are wanting to share information with teachers or academics, you can certainly copy the URL and send it to them. You can print pages from that website, from ADCET and from those pages in particular. And as Julie and Joe showcase in their presentation, there are you know, tools in there such as the letter out to the person doing assessment and so forth. So hopefully you find it very useful, because it's been fantastic to work with Julie and Joe on this project and to revamp Opening All Options. So no other questions. Any final remarks, Julie and Joe, before we finish?
No, thank you, Darlene. It was great to be able to share it today.
Yeah, and thank everybody for your patience. We've had a lot of technical difficulties in Julie's end, and then we've had Joe's lovely husband probably talking in the background, so it's been a challenging webinar, so I thank everybody for their patience. They probably haven't seen the stress that Jane and I have been feeling this back end, hopefully, but once again, we're really excited to have brought you another webinar, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and look forward to getting your feedback around opening all options. So take care, and thank everybody.